The last major component I want to talk about for this project before we move into the project wrap up and publish and deliver the actual game project for this is I want to talk a little bit about materials. Now, materials are, it's a very big subject and we'll look at it in very simple terms. We can use materials to modify the color of our objects inside Unity. Now, the way that I'm going to do this is it's a best practice to create a materials subfolder inside our assets folder. So I'm just going to go down to our project tab and I'm going to go to assets. Now, way back when, early in this presentation, I created a test folder to demonstrate that what we create inside our asset folder shows up inside our project folder, but I no longer need this test folder. I could repurpose it by renaming it, or I could right click on it and choose to delete it, just like I would in the hierarchy, or I can select it and choose Command Delete, just like I do in the hierarchy, to get rid of that object or that folder. I'm going to right click and choose to create. I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call this Materials, and I'll hit Return. Now, if I double click, I'm entered. I've gone into the material folder. I can see over here on the left side of my project folder, and let me just, if I can move this over a little bit. I have my assets folder. I have my material folder. So I can go into assets. I see the contents of my assets, and I can double click inside material, or I can use this window on the left side to simply navigate inside the hierarchy, inside the root of the material folder. Now, just be aware that on my assets folder, let me just get this off the edge of my screen a little bit. To the left of my assets folder, or any folder actually, there's a little triangle, and if you inadvertently click on that triangle, you're revealing or collapsing the contents of that folder. So by default, it should be open, so you should see the content. If you don't see the content of your assets folder, just click on that little triangle. So I want to go into my material folder, and I want to create a new material for the different objects inside my scene. I'm going to right click and choose to create. And what I want to create is a material object. So I'll create the material object, and I get this default material. It says new material. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a ground material. Now, with that material selected, I've renamed it. I'm going to go over here to the inspector. I'm going to let the shader component default. I'm going to let the render mode default. And what I'm most interested in setting is the albedo color. Okay, so I'm under the main maps here. It says albedo. And to the right of that is a little color swatch. And by default, it's white. I'm just going to click on that, and that opens up this color picker, conveniently on the opposite side of the screen. And this allows me to choose a different color. So I have my hue slider here. So we have the hue. I can slide it into whatever color I'd like. And then I have my saturation. So I'm just going to try to find kind of like maybe like a kind of an earthy green color maybe for now. Okay. And I'll close that color picker. Now, I've chosen the albedo color, and the smoothness, if I look up here at the smoothness, it's going to address a little bit of the kind of the quality of the reflection that we're going to have here. It's a combination of the metallic and the smoothness. I'm going to let that default for now, but just know that you can kind of play with these values. So, and I can do this after the fact as well. So I'm going to take that ground material, and I can apply this material two different ways. I can simply drag and drop it on the object in my scene. So as I roll around inside my scene, you can see that it highlights the object. Or I can drag that material directly into, I'll find, where is it? There's my floor or my ground, and I'll drop it on my floor object. Now when I do that, you can see that the material component has been added to that object, and so I'll do the same thing I'll make another material and do the same thing for my sphere. Now I'm going to call this, this will be, for now I'm going to call these materials according to their color, just to keep this very simple. And so I'm going to create kind of a red color for the sphere. Maybe make this a little bit more saturated. There we go. And this time around, I'll just drag and drop that on the sphere. I'll create another material, and I'll call this maybe some sort of gray. and just kind of somewhere in there. I'll take this gray and I'll make that second sphere gray. And I'll create finally a fourth material. And I'm going to make this material almost black. I'll simply call it black for now. In the future, we'll kind of name these materials as to what they should represent or what object they'll be attached to. But for now, I'm just going to keep it really simple. Kind of shift this into the blue, but make it very dark. And I'll drop that on my domino. So I'll just kind of go through and assign this material to each one of these dominoes. Now I only have a couple of dominoes inside my scene, and had I applied the material before I duplicated them, I wouldn't have to apply them to so many objects. So I'll Command D to duplicate this again, and I'll move this forward. This time I'll move it forward a little bit, but I'll also rotate it along its y-axis. Okay, so I'll kind of point it in a different direction. So I'll just move it maybe -10. I'll select that domino again and duplicate it. Move it kind of forward and over just a little bit, and I'll change that to -20. I'm just kind of getting it to kind of, just move that over and position a little bit different. Now, in this case, when I'm making some design decisions, there's a couple of tools that I can leverage. The first thing is that I generally want to move this according to one axis, right? So I'm grabbing this along its x-axis, and I can drag and kind of move that in space, okay? And then I'll move it according to its z. But I'm moving it now relative to the ground plane, the xz plane. I'm not moving it along y, or at least I don't want to at this point. And so what I can do is, in addition to this movement axes, these different axes, by rolling over the axes and restricting my motion to one axis, I can use the transform component here as well. What I can do is, you'll see there's these little planes, these little cubes, or these little squares that represent a parallel plane. And if I want to restrict my movement of this object to the ground plane in this case, what I can do is I can roll over this little green square where these axes converge. And if I use that little square and I click and drag, you can see that no matter how loose I am with the mouse, it's restricting it, it's not moving it according to the y-axis. Okay, so if I were to do the same thing with the x or the z plane, I can move it around and it does not move according to z. Okay, so that blue plane restricts it, does not move it according to z. The green plane restricts it and does not move it according to y. And I can get a lot of mileage out of that if I just kind of flatten out my view a little bit. I'll grab this and kind of move it, and I can be a little bit more intuitive about the setup of this. So right about there, I'll Command D to duplicate. I'll move this over, and I'll change that value to -30. I'll be a little bit more dramatic with that and change that to -40. So you can see that I can just kind of go through, change that to a little bit, kind of move that position, and let's see what that gives us. I'll hit the play button. I have my red sphere falling through space, and I'm knocking down my dominoes, and so now I'll build some kind of elaborate little gravity simulation here. Now, one other thing that I want to point out, something that you can just experiment and play with, and that is that I'm going to grab my second sphere. I'll call this even my gray sphere. And if I want to, I can adjust the mass of this object. So by default, the mass of all these objects are 1, and we can kind of think of this in simple terms as kind of the weight of the object. If I change that to 0.2, my original sphere has a mass of 1, and now the gray sphere has much less mass, and it'll be affected much more by the forces of gravity, or the force of other objects running into it. Okay, so you can kind of play around with some of these values. If I make this first domino much more massive, I'll bump that up to 10. Let's see how that affects the basic gravity simulation. In fact, I don't even think that sphere can barely knock that first domino over. So you can play with a lot of different values. Okay, I'll just set that back to 1. Finally, there are a couple of different kinds of materials that we can create. By default, we just created these simple color materials, but there's another kind of material which will be very fun to play with in this kind of environment, which is a physic material. Okay, where we can adjust the style of physics that are applied to our individual objects. And to demonstrate this, I'm going to select my sphere, my original sphere. I'm going to right click and choose to create. And rather than create material, this time around I'm going to create a physic material. This new physic material, I'm going to call it bounce. And with it selected, you can see that if I look up here in the inspector with that object selected, I'm not assigning a color to it, but I can assign something to all of these different variables that are here. And the one that I'm interested in for this demonstration is the bounciness. Okay, and I can bump that all the way up from 0 to 1. I'll set it to 1. And I'll go back to my sphere, and I can click and drag this bounce onto my sphere. Okay, and now let me undo that, and I want to point out what's happening here. With the sphere selected, when I drag this bounce to it, what it's actually doing is applying the sphere collider to the sphere collider component. There's a special material in here that has a field for a physic material. And if I just click and drag the bounce and throw it on my sphere, you can see that that sphere collider material value inherited the bounce. Okay, I'll Command Z to undo that. Alternatively, we can drag the bounce directly into that material field. And if we want to get rid of it, the way that we remove that, if we've gone about our business and continue to design our level, and we decide that, well, I really don't want that bounce there, there's a little bullet to the right of it. If I click on that bullet, it'll give me a list of all the physic materials that I have inside my scene, and I can choose none and just close that window. Now I no longer have that bounce assigned. But in this case, I do want that bounce assigned. So I'll just drag the bounce to the ball, and I'll hit play. And now you can see that that ball starts to bounce a bit as it collides with different objects. So experiment with some of those, some of these things that we've looked at. Compose a scene and build a compelling gravity level scene. Make sure that you save as you go. In the next presentation, we'll talk about how we're going to package these and deliver these as assignments, but we'll do that in the next presentation.